Rise and shine, YouTube. Today we're going to dive right into this review. It's going to be a speed pad roundup. Starting off first, we got the Dornfinger Firestarter. Now, huge shout outs to Gen 3D and Dornfinger for getting this out to me. This pad actually took a little bit of time to kind of get used to it because it is an XOF base and it is an alpha cell base. So being an XOF base, it takes me a little longer to get used to it because I do kind of press harder on my mice when I'm playing, right? I put a little more pressure behind it. And for an XOF base, I can put not too much pressure behind it, and I can feel pretty much my desk. So when it comes down to this pad is actually very quick. The surface is nice and smooth. It's probably one of the smoothest surfaces out there. There's no texture to it. There's no texture to it when you glide on it with different skates, right? This is the stock Lamzu skates. These are Jade Speed dots from X-Ray Pad, and I got the Ryse V2 on my Superlight too. When it comes down to the different size skates, I do feel like the size of the skate kind of matters on this pad, just because when I glide the Superlight 2 over it and put a little pressure behind it, you get a tiny bit of tug. So larger skates, in my opinion, just will feel slightly slower than kind of like the thinner or dot kind of style skates. For example, when I'm gliding the Jade Speed dots around on the pad, it feels quicker than the Superlight 2 with the Ryse V2, but the downside on this being an XOF pad is when I get in a little more intense and I put a little more pressure behind the glide, I do sometimes bottom out my mouse. And then when you use the Lamzu, Maya, and the stock skates, you can put a good amount of pressure on this, and then you don't really bottom out the mouse. You got the form-fitted skates here, and they're nice and thin, so these also feel very quick compared to the Superlight, which, yes, it is quick, but you get a slower experience than both of the other two skates prior. The size on this pad is 500 by 500, and the stitching is actually very well done. It's nice and tight. Their stitching falls in line with the surface, so when you go to move your arm back, you don't actually feel the surface actually catch on your skin, which is a very nice thing for me. I don't like feeling nice and sharp stitching. I don't like that at all. So overall, 500 by 500, nice, smooth, quick surface. I do recommend smaller skates, and if you are light-handed, so if you fingertip mice and you don't really put a lot of pressure behind it, this pad would be phenomenal. If you are heavy-handed, right, like I am, you might take you a little longer to get used to the pad to kind of ease up on the pressure that you put down your mouse, but also the pad still feels very well for you. So overall, if you want a 500 by 500 pad that is in the quick category, the Dornfinger Firestarter is actually a phenomenal pad. I'm going to continue using this, right, just to get more gameplay clips, more things that I can post on Twitter, just because I like it, and I like how it feels on the skin. And there you go. Next up, we're going to be talking about the Infinity Mice Speed V2. The Infinity Mice Speed V2, now this guy was also sent out to me from Infinity Mice, so shout out to them. This pad is, once again, another nice, smooth feeling surface, right? There is no, like, texture into it. Comparing it to the Firestarter still feels a lot smoother. It feels more satin. It feels more like... It feels more smooth. It feels along the lines of a Ryse with the Firestarter kind of surface smoothness. With the Infinity Mice Speed V2, it has that smooth feeling, but it feels like a texture kind of similar to the Raiden, but tiny bit less textured, right? Both those pads are nice and smooth. This just is ever so slightly smoother. When it comes to the skates, right? The skates on both the Maya Superlight M2 dots are nice and quick, right? Even when I put down pressure, there is no inconsistencies, right? No tug, it's still very open, but with dots, I can still push down and bottom out the mouse if I push down hard enough. It is a lot harder to do that on here than the Firestarter, hence the soft versus the XOF base, but it's still a good pad, and I still like using dots because it's harder for me to sink in. When it comes to the larger skates, I actually find this to be more consistent than the Firestarter, because if I put down pressure on here, the speed really doesn't change, right? Just fingertip users, palm, claw users, right? You can put down a good amount of pressure with large form-fitted skates, and you don't get really that inconsistent with the amount of force you push down. When it comes to the Maya small skates, once again, the pad doesn't give, right? It's still consistent, even with the small pressure or more pressure you put down. It doesn't change the speed and the glide, which is something that I really like about this mouse pad, right? And why I've enjoyed using it over most of the pads that I've actually tried over the last couple of weeks. When it comes to the stitching is in line with the base, where you can move your arm over the stitching, and it doesn't catch, it doesn't come up over the surface and like hit your arm while you're brazing over it. When it comes to the base, once again, I keep saying the base is soft, which is good. I have the mid on pre-order in blue, and it has like these nice design that it doesn't stick up from the base, right? You can see here that there is no like extra like bumpiness to the back, which is good, but this allows the pad to stick really, really well. I can pull it and it doesn't want to move until I pull extremely hard on it, but it's kind of like suction cupped to your desk, but you don't have any like the bouncy suction cup feeling on the back of this pad. So overall, speed is nice. It's, in my opinion, more consistent than the Firestarter, and it is just ever so slightly smoother than the X-Off Raiden. So if you want a nice pad that isn't super expensive, like $60, if you want something that has enough room for you to do what you need to do, the Infinity Mice Speed 2 is probably a really good pickup for you. So next up, we are going to talk about the Lethal Gaming Gear Neptune. The Lethal Gaming Gear Neptune. Now, this is their standard version. This is not the Pro. I purchased this one myself. And, well, the surface is, once again, in line with the Infinity Mice Speed, the X-Off Raiden, right? It has that, like, it has a little more textured smoothness to it than the Infinity Mice Speed V2, and it has more texture feedback on the skates. So with Ryse V2, Maya stock skates, and dots, you get a textured feedback to it. So if you're one of those guys who don't want super, super smooth, you want a little bit of texture to the pad, this Neptune is actually a pretty good pad for you. Now let's talk about speed. Speed is nice and quick. When you put a little more force down, you get that control that you need. So if you're somebody like me who's heavy-handed, you're going to think that this pad is more... It's not as fast as the Raiden. It's not as fast as the Infinity Mice Speed 2, right? It's not along those lines of speed, unless you're somebody who puts less pressure and you pretty much fingertip, right? You're going to find this pad to be nice and quick. For me, when I use my mice, I get a little bit of a tug to it because I push down a little harder, and that actually gives me a little more control. Now, am I looking for that control and speed? Not really, but I do perform very, very well on this pad, right? I have had no issues with target transfers on Call of Duty. I have no issues in tracking in Apex, right? And when I get that nice speed, this is a good like speed pad for Valorant as well, because when you're trying to actually line up that crosshair with headshots, it's not hard to do. You're not worrying about overshooting, undershooting, and all that. So the Lethal Gaming Gear Neptune, even on dots, it actually is pretty quick, but you get that sense of control, more pressure you put down, because this pad gives you the speed and it gives you the control when you need it, right? Base is a standard base, right? Doesn't stick to the desk at all, right? Now, if I have my arm on it and I'm putting pressure down, it doesn't move, but you can pick it up and move it whenever you need to. The stitching falls in line with the surface, doesn't catch my skin, feels very good. There's no fraying, there's no issues with it. Now, the only thing with this pad is I wish this pad did come flat packaged. This comes in a nice nice big tube, but it still doesn't lay flat right out of the tube, right? If companies just get away with the tubes, the flat packaging, all that, nobody will have any issues with any curling or anything like that, and trying to get the mouse pad to sit flat. So their Pro version won't come in a tube, but it'll become flat packaged. So if you want a surface that is more, it's a pretty smooth experience, it's more textured on the skates, it's slightly textured on the skin, and you want that speed, but you also want that control in line with it, the Lethal Gaming Gear Neptune would be a good pad for you. Next up, we're going to talk about the Crucible. Now, the Crucible is my least favorite just because of the surface and how it performs. So we're going to talk about that. So let's get to it. All right, the Crucible from Padsmiths. Now, this was also sent out to me for review. And well, this isn't my favorite pad out of the bunch, right? It's a surface that I want to fall in love with, but I just can't because I don't like it, right? So starting off first with the surface feel on the skin, it is smooth. It feels right in line with the Neptune feel on the skin, but where it's different is the textured feedback on the skates. All skates that you use, you're going to get a textured feedback to, and the texture gets more intense the lower or the smaller skates you put on. So dots, you're going to feel the texture a lot more. Smaller Maya skates, you feel the texture once again more. But on the large super light Tiger Ryse V2, you get less textured feedback than both of these other two mice. But once again, the super light V2 Tiger Ice once again feels the slower out of the bunch, right? Where this pad feels quick, right? But it feels more in line with like a balance pad. So like if I do a glide test, it just stops, right? It stops right on a dime. I wouldn't really say this pad is a true speed pad because it wants to be a speed, but it also wants to be a control at the same time. And I feel like they just butt heads, and it just makes the pad feel kind of inconsistent from my perspective, because I am heavy-handed, right? So I kind of engulf my mice because I got small hands, right? So when I use the grip that I normally use and I put a little more pressure behind the mouse, the pad slows down more than the Neptune does when I put pressure behind that mouse pad. And when testing this mouse pad, it kind of just, it wasn't working out for me with the long tracking, where if I'm going from a small target that is pretty far away, such as like Call of Duty, all right, tracking that target, sometimes when I put a little more pressure down, mouse kind of slows down mid-track, and it just doesn't feel consistent for me. The larger skates, right, get more controlled, the more pressure you down. So like when I put pressure down on the super light, this feels like like a true balance pad, right? It just doesn't feel all too great in my opinion. The Maya skates put more pressure down. It is quicker than the super light, but once again, like for me using this pad, it just wasn't the greatest experience. The back on the pad, it's nice. It sticks to the desk. The base is a mid base. It's just where I don't fall in love with this pad is the surface. Now, if this pad was an X soft or soft, I don't actually think that would work. The mid base fits this mouse pad perfectly. So if you're somebody who is looking for a pad that has a badass design, it's a mid base, it has textured feedback on the skates, it gets more controlled as you push down, then the Crucible would be for you. If you're somebody who wants a more consistent pad, then I actually wouldn't recommend the Crucible. So, Crucible from Padsmiths. Next, we're going to talk about a pad that isn't necessarily a speed pad, but it's the last pad of the roundup. And I would use it over the Crucible all day. Let's get into it. All right, the last pad in the roundup. It isn't a speed pad, but it isn't a control pad. It's a nice balanced pad in my opinion. When it comes down to the CL2 from PureTrak, it is $25. Has no crazy stitching. It has no crazy back, right? But it sticks better to the desk than the Neptune does for less price. And I feel like I like this surface more than the Neptune and the Crucible, because to me, it feels more consistent. Even though it is a slower pad, it feels more consistent in my opinion. The surface feel on the skin falls in line with all the other pads. It's nice and smooth. You get a hint of texture to it on your skin, but it's still a smooth pad. When you get the surface feel on the skates, it's very smooth. You have no texture feedback to it, and it feels very, very good. Now the speed, like I said, this is a balanced pad, but it's a consistent pad. When you use a larger mouse, larger skates, you get a sense of more control than smaller skates, dots, right? It's just how it is, right? I can use this mouse and get a more balanced feel, but I can put more pressure behind it, get a tiny bit more control, but it feels more consistent in my opinion. When you use fingertip grip, right? For those who don't engulf the mouse like I do, put more pressure behind it, it feels the same speed, right? When I use the M2, right? This is how I grip the M2. And when I put more pressure behind dots, one, I don't bottom out the mouse, but two, the dots feel the same speed. I don't get a sense of tug, and I feel like the mouse glide is more consistent than the Crucible. It's just how it is, right? That's just surfaces, different grips, different pressures, all that. When you talk about the Maya has form-fitted skates, but they're nice and small. For me, the Maya feels better than the dots, right? They feel a little quicker and with more pressure, right? I'm actually putting a good amount of pressure behind the Maya right now versus fingertip, right? It still feels very consistent. So when you talk about a nice $25 pad, you can see that it has a balance, but it stops on a dime. That's because it's a balanced pad, right? It wants to stop your mouse, but it doesn't have that tuggy feeling to it, right? It doesn't have that mud aspect to it. So overall, I would actually use the CL2 over the Crucible and probably the Neptune just because of how consistent it feels. It is a slower pad, but one, it's cheaper. Two, I just like how it performs. And three, I'm excited to see what the next mouse pads PureTrak comes out because honestly, they're not talked about enough. So if you want a pad that is a good balanced pad, if you want a pad that is a good consistent pad between heavy-handed players, light-handed players, right? The CL2 is it's a steal for $25. So that is the last pad of the roundup. If you did like the video, hit that thumbs up, hit that subscribe. I know this is probably one of the longer videos, but you got a bunch of mouse pads to check out. And there you go. So rise up, love you guys, and most importantly, God bless.